Hello and welcome to Sticky from the Inside, the employee engagement podcast that looks at how to build stickier, competition-smashing, consistently successful organisations from the inside out. I'm your host, Andy Gorham, and I'm on a mission to help more businesses turn the lights on behind the eyes of their employees, light the fires within them, and create tons more success for everyone. This podcast is for all those who believe that's something worth going after and would like a little help and guidance in achieving that. Each episode, we dive into the topics that can help create what I call stickier businesses. The sort of businesses where people thrive and love to work, and where more customers stay with you and recommend you to others because they love what you do and why you do it. So, if you want to take the tricky out of being sticky, listen on. Okay, my friends, today I am truly living the dream. You know how much a fan I am of human and business psychology. Well, in today's episode, we're going to take a look at how these worlds combine when we're looking at people and team development. And I get to speak to one of my heroes on the topic today, which I'm so looking forward to. Now, many of you will have no doubt taken some form of psychometric test or personality or team assessment at work at some point in your career. The names Myers-Briggs, Insight, DISC, Lumina Spark, Hogan may be names you recognize. And if you don't, and if you haven't been exposed to something like that, I hope this episode inspires you to find out more come the end. But today, I'm joined by Dr. Stewart Desson, who's the CEO of the international selection and development company, Lumina Learning. He's the architect of the Lumina Spark personality assessment tool that I'm a qualified practitioner in, and you've heard me talk about a fair bit on this show before. The Lumina Learning Mission is to transform organizations by celebrating people one human at a time. Now, if ever there was a statement in line with the sentiment of this podcast, that was it. Now, I've personally had some wonderful moments using this tool with clients, and in today's show, I want to find out a bit more about what inspired Stewart to take on the established view of psychometrics and bring something arguably richer and more colourful to the table. I want to investigate what Stewart means about when he talks around the topic of humanistic psychology and the role that self-awareness really does play in our development. And with neurodiversity taking a more conscious position in the workplace today, I'd like to understand how that's influencing the work he does on people selection and development. Now, Stewart is on the management board of the Association for Business Psychology, as well as being a chartered fellow of the CIPD. He also possesses a master's degree in operational research, as well as being educated and experienced in the practical application of psychology. And all that is supported by a second master's in change agency from the University of Surrey. So I reckon I'm in very safe hands with this topic today, and I just can't wait to dive in. Welcome to the show, Stewart.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for your kind words. With that sort of introduction, I'm really looking forward to what I might say.
I'm really looking forward to what you might say. I've personally loved using Lumina Spark as a tool, and having been exposed to various of that list of assessments back in my career, I'm just really interested to sort of understand more about where it came from and what your influences were, and then really what you're doing with it going forward. But before I get all excited and into all of that, do me a favor, Stuart. Can you just give my listeners a bit of an intro to you and perhaps give us a bit of an insight into what you're really focused on right now?
Okay, well, I'm the CEO, I'm the founder of Lumina Learning. I'm sort of the author of the Lumina Spark psychometric itself. That was the basis of the PhD that I did. In terms of, where's it come from? Well, it's sort of come from my life experience blended with professional experience and some of the academic side. So it's really quite a genuine mixture. I mean, where are we going right now? We're focused on the selection and development market, providing psychometrics that create actually solutions for typically large organizations. And I would say one of our key focuses right now is digitizing that experience, as well as removing the sort of pathologizing that some psychometric or psychological approaches engage in. So we're bringing in more of a humanistic psychology approach into this realm that maybe previously done a different way.
I think that's really interesting, and we will definitely dig into that humanistic psychology thing, because it's easy to think, well, that's psychology is all about humans, right? But I think in its applications in business and human, there is a blend and a mismatch at times. I suspect we'll find out.
Yes.
I mentioned in the intro that you sort of took on an established view of what psychometrics were, how they should be used, what they even looked like, and were trying to bring a sort of richer, more colourful, I guess, experience to that table. When you were looking at the world of psychometrics, what did you see that was going on that perhaps didn't quite sit well enough with you, and I guess inspired you to pursue this more humanistic psychological approach? And actually, what on earth does that really mean, Stewart? Define that for us.
Okay, let me try. Well, it's been a 20-year journey, really, to get to the point where I decided that I wanted to create Lumina Spark. So it probably started with my personal experience. I've been on a few leadership programs. People have tried to develop me and coach me. And my experience in those early days was that some of the models that were applied to me, that were done to me, I wasn't too keen on. They typed me, they labeled me, they boxed me, and labels I think should be for clothing, not for human for human beings. So my initial experience was like being told, are you a thinker or a feeler? And someone trying to coach me and figure out which I am, and I was determined to say I'm both. Yeah. So that was my early experience of trying to breaking sort of typing models. I would say later, when I moved into this area, because I didn't start out in L&D in psychology, I started out in something called operational research. But when I moved into sort of leadership roles and then transitioned towards HR, L&D, and so on, that's when I experienced becoming a practitioner. And I found, using many different models, some dissatisfaction that the predominant frame was your personality's fixed. You've got one, it's to a large extent genetic, it's stuck to you, it's glued to your face, that's your lot. And I didn't like working with those frameworks, even if the clients liked them and wanted them. And I came to embrace humanistic psychology and hold the view that our personalities are dynamic, the context's important, who we're with is important, and there will be a shift. And that's when I decided I went through a phase of saying I'm not going to work with psychometrics at all, they're too rigid and old school. And then after a few years, I came back to saying, how can I apply my knowledge around quantifying stuff to come up with a dynamic model of personality? So that was some of my dissatisfaction that led to the thinking of Lumina Spark. I guess the final piece of the jigsaw was, not only are we dynamic, but I didn't want to pathologize. And consequently, the idea that who I am underneath is one thing, how I behave with others, I dial up, I adjust is another, but then I can overextend. Sometimes that can be dysfunctional. Sometimes it can be just what's required in a circumstance. I normally overextend because in the past, at some level, it's worked for me. I'm getting some sort of payoff from it. And so rather than viewing that as a deep dysfunction and going into people's childhood, let's view it in humanistic psychology. For me, is all about, let's be an optimist. We can learn and grow, and we're a dynamic, and let's work with that. So that's probably the biggest influence. The final bit would be the PhD, of course. And interesting, when I did the PhD, the initial challenge from other professors was, well, you've got all this great experience, Stuart, but I'm going to call it anecdotal, and we need to work with in a research paradigm that says, have you read the papers and got the evidence to prove it? So that required a deeper understanding of what other people have said on this topic, in addition to my experience. And that was a useful piece in terms of the development of Spark to make it extremely rigorous and evidence-based.
And having gone through the program to understand all of that, the theory and validity piece behind the model itself is a whole nother podcast. I mean, there is a whole bunch of
we can do another on that.
Detail.
That is also a passion of me, so I can sort of regress into my inner nerd, because I did start out in life as a sort of a statistician, operational researcher, but maybe for another day. Yeah.
Maybe. And I think this is what's interesting, isn't it? Because this whole world I think, well, my personal experience of going through the Spark thing, and this may apply to anybody who's been through any of these tools from a practitioner perspective, is that, when I sort of signed up for it, Stuart, I had the expectation of, right, I'm going to come out of this in the X number of days, and I'm going to know everything about someone's personality. I'm going to know everything about stuff that's going on behind the scenes. And the reality was that is not the case. What the case is that what the tool allows you to do is start to uncover some very, very interesting coaching conversations, right? Is really get to people to have a look at what's going on within themselves. But more importantly, and I think this is what should be the premise behind all of these things, is, well, what does that practically mean for me? What does that practically mean for the team that I work in? What does that practically mean for the relationships I have with people? And what does it practically mean for the business that I'm a part of? And I think that's what's really interesting, is that those conversations open up a whole huge mine of places to go that you can investigate all those sorts of things and take a really good look at under the bonnet, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, for me, under the bonnet happens through dialogue.
Yes.
So it's one thing to measure something, but measurement is not the answer. Measurement is something that's a good starting point for that dialogue. And being into humanistic psychology, I'm an optimist. We can learn, we can grow, develop, and guess what? We do that through conversations and exploration and being curious and being open.
Absolutely. There's definitely a switch from that fixed mindset approach to a much more open mindset approach when you use these things.
Yeah.
So thinking about that humanistic psychology, thinking about your experiences and going through the PhD, based on all of that background, what principally were you setting out to achieve when you were putting Spark together?
I wanted to create a tool that would be a catalyst for people's development. And I wanted that tool to break the mold and be disruptive and challenging to the other tools that are currently used in the market. And in particular, I wanted to take some concepts that are not normally put into psychometrics. Your personality is dynamic. It can change. It depends on the context and who you're with. And we might overdo things, but it might not be dark and dysfunctional. I wanted to take those ideas that would normally happen in a rich coaching dialogue or in group sessions with really experienced facilitators, but truly enable the psychometric to enable that and take it further and make it happen faster, to speed up those conversations. And I wanted to remove the resistance that I'd experienced when using other tools on the market that, unconsciously were taking people back to a more traditional, either medical or biological model of personality, which often reflected the personality of the originators of those models. So as my friend Nikita Mikhailov often says, if you really want to understand the psychometric, look at who created it, look at their personality and see what you can learn from that first, which I think is probably spot on.
Yeah, here's my world. This is what everything looks like. Judge yourself against that.
I mean, at another level, the Spark model, if I'm really honest, it's an attempt by me at a very personal level to make sense of the world and make sense of my psychology and those around me, which is one reason it has the balance in it, because other psychometrics may, place more emphasis on measuring, let's say, extroversion constructively, positively, or a cheerful leader, and typically put less emphasis on, being introverted, at least in a constructive way. Maybe introversion's shy and quiet and withdrawn. I really wanted to bring, a balance to that. And that was me trying to make sense of my world and my introversion and extroversion. And equally, in terms of what the Big Five calls conscientiousness, which is highly prized often in graduate recruitment. You want conscientious graduates. But I suddenly realized, well, hey, guess what? I'm not particularly conscientious. So in Lumina, we call that being discipline driven. That's quite low. What can we say about the opposite of it, which we call inspiration driven, seize the moment, a little bit random, let it emerge? Those qualities which are highly prized in humanistic psychology, but not typically valued in corporate recruitment processes. How could we have a model that could do both? I didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I want, some of us are very disciplined, some of us are very inspired and emergent. Some of us do both. I want a holistic model that allows us to look at that. That was the purpose, really. Yeah.
And did you feel that, I mean, that whether it was conscious or unconscious, the sort of pigeonholing was one of the major kind of issues with existing tools or established tools out?
I absolutely did. That was my personal experience before, before I got into psychology. When I was doing other things in my early career, I very much felt that I was being pigeonholed. I remember being told that I was very much an extroverted intuitive, and because of that, I shouldn't get a job in a certain operational area, and it limited my career. Well, it probably delayed it a year or so because I'm quite determined and don't want to let a psychometric get in the way of what I want to do. But I experienced it limiting me, and I experienced seeing people being pigeonholed in a corporate setting in an unhelpful way, in a way that caused some people to want to be a certain type, even though they weren't. So when we type and label, we oversimplify, and there are huge risks in that we'll project onto other people, we'll oversimplify other people, and it may even impact our own development. I've seen, typing being used as an excuse by people. I remember somebody once saying, "I'm sorry, I've just upset that customer, but I am the extroverted thinking type. What do you expect?" And no, it's not supposed to be used as an excuse. It's supposed to be used to explore. Now, of course, I know there's brilliant typing practitioners out there, and I don't wish to offend them, because a really good typing practitioner knows that it's not about the label. They go much, much deeper. However, I have to say, my experience was I was labeled, and I have, I've seen that happen, and I don't want to go there. I want to do the opposite. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point about the practitioner themselves, because I think I've certainly, in my early career going through some of these tests, it's been, I guess it's been a veneer kind of a treatment of the result and the model, and people do then walk away going, well, that you would say that you're an ENFP or whatever it might be. I also wonder whether, Stewart, I'm interested to sort of think about your view on this. In today's world of leadership and recruitment and what have you, and the kind of changing landscape we're seeing, is the traditional view of what a leader looks like, and therefore that's the type we're after, being challenged? And is that why, tools like Spark and others are, I guess, very useful in identifying what someone is, as opposed to fixing them to a specific type? So I don't know. Typically, maybe in the past, we'd have said, oh, the ideal kind of leader is a red-yellow combination, and therefore, if you're not that, you've got no chance of being a decent leader. Are we challenging that view now, and are tools looking at that?
We are challenging that view, and there's a distinction to be drawn here between what sorts of people are attracted to roles and those that are most effective. So it is the case, and I can see this in my data, that on balance, people who are in the C-suite, particularly CEOs, they do tend to be more extroverted. They do tend to be more outcome focused. On balance, they have a degree of discipline and so on. However, just because those are the sorts of people that are attracted to those roles, or they're the sort of people that get promoted into those roles, doesn't mean that they are the best, and that should double down on that sort of what I would call bias and recruit in that one image. That's the problem with some of the AI recruitment techniques used. I don't know if you heard a few years ago, Amazon were using AI in recruitment, and because certain people with certain traits are in certain roles, AI doesn't really discriminate. It just takes the data and builds in. It can reinforce these biases. So I think Amazon found that they were starting to exclude women from certain leadership roles because they were using a black box AI algorithm. And that's exactly what we want to avoid.
Yeah.
So in my experience, as we move towards more inclusive leaders who know how to manage the diversity of a team and harness, many forms of diversity, including psychological diversity, that means we need to be open to more diverse leaders as well. So one of the benefits of Lumina Spark is that it actually quantifies constructively leaders who could be counterculture. Now, the most counterculture leader is one that's a little bit more introverted and contained, not so disciplined, but quite inspired and go with the flow. And maybe one who's not typically so resilient, but actually is living in a rich world of emotion, and feels things quite passionately. Those are the leaders that will typically have a hard time even getting onto a high potential leadership program.
Yeah.
To be sort of screened out. But actually, if we want to operate inclusively in organizations, we need to be open to being inclusive around our leadership as well. So I guess I'm here to say that whatever our personality, there are strengths, there are challenges in our leadership and our leadership development. And I think what we should be doing when we develop leaders is working with who's there and helping them become more effective in terms of how can they dial things up, dial things down, how can they be more self-aware of who they are, and working authentically with who they are rather than going for a cookie cutter approach and typing. So, I mean, you mentioned, leaders get typed. Sales people do as well. There's an approach to the sales challenger, which really effectively says we want a certain type to be in sales. And I guess to put my cards on the table, I'm pretty hostile to any approach that says you need one type for any one role. It's too reductionist, it's too simplistic, and it's definitely not inclusive.
Yeah, and I think we'll dig into some more of that inclusivity a bit later on. I want to just reference the cut. You've mentioned the sort of personalities when we're talking about individuals, and I think one of the most interesting things doing portrait debriefs with clients on this stuff is the peeling back of the layers from the top line report, which in the majority of cases, people look at it and go, yeah, it's about 90% me, at least on average. But I'm not sure about this, that, and the other. It's when you're peeling back the layers of personality that this sort of stuff, I think, really starts to have value. So just for the benefit of the listeners, just explain the approach around dynamic personality, the three personas, and why that's important for you.
So what I found from my experience, but also what the research literature says, is you don't really have one personality. That's sort of a dated concept. It depends who you're with and what you're doing. And it also suggests that underneath, partly through our genetics, partly through our upbringing, and the role models and leaders in our life, we do have a preference for expressing ourselves in a certain way. So for me, underneath, I like to be very clear in my thinking. In my natural preference, I quite like being direct with people. And I also like going with the flow and not being tied down. Let's call that my underlying persona. It's what I gravitate towards if I don't have to deal with customers or different relationships or partners and so on. Let's call that the underlying. However, I don't exist in my underlying persona. I don't go around doing exactly what I want and feel like all the time. I have to function in the world with roles and family relationships and so on. So I rise to things every day. And of course, there's an identity that I might bring. I want to be seen as someone that's more organized. So maybe I dial back a bit of my freewheeling nature that you might see on a Saturday. And at work, I strive to be somewhat more structured. And although underneath I like to be direct and clear with everybody, I often in my relationship, in my chats with you, Andy, I'll want to be a bit more diplomatic. I'll dial up my people focus and tone down my bluntness that I might be thinking in my head, because for whatever reason, that's how I want to be seen. So we call that your everyday persona. And using some of the sort of Viktor Frankl concept of free will, I bring my free will to that. There's some choice in it, but there's some unconscious stuff as well. I can get triggered in situations, but I firmly believe we have free will and we can develop ourselves and dial up and dial down. So that's the distinction between who we are underneath and who we are every day. And really one simple definition of emotional intelligence that I like is I know who I am underneath, and I'm aware of how I dial up and dial things down, and I can bring my conscious will to it. That actually is a key part of emotional intelligence. The other persona that we have, so we have that underlying bit, the everyday persona. The third bit is what we do when we get triggered, or what we do when we do too much of a good thing, or, overextend. So in my case, I'm quite clear in my mind underneath. I'm much more diplomatic when I'm speaking to you, Andy, and we haven't done it yet. But if you were to trigger me and hurt me in the eye, I might suddenly come out and go back to being overly blunt, because that sometimes comes out in my overextended. And, part of being coached is to be coachable and be willing to look at that and think, is that really serving me? Maybe in certain circumstances it is, but actually not all the time. So can I notice what triggers me? And can I engage in some disciplines and practices to get back to equilibrium and be more, effective? So that's what I would call we call that the three personas, and we're a dynamic. We're always moving between them. Of course, we're even more than three. Three is a nice number for a good dialogue. We have many, many different personas. If you like, I have my persona as a CEO when I'm working with my team, and I have a different persona when I'm with my kids, and so on. So different contexts will draw that out as well.
I think that's such a great point. And a lot of the questions that, clients, coachees always end up referencing is the context going to change my result? Is it going to influence my personality? And the simple answer to that is yes. Yes, it will.
And there's a great academic theory that I've drawn on that explains this. It's called trait activation theory by a brilliant psychologist called Tet. And the theory basically says is we've got many, many traits dormant, in us, and you could consider that part of the underlying, but certain traits are activated in a certain context. Yeah. So whereas I'm not normally, for example, aggressive towards people, that's not something I would normally do. I'm rarely triggered to be aggressive in a work context, but I remember, some 15 years ago, an altercation at a train station where someone was being incredibly racially abusive, and ultimately needed to engage and get somebody arrested and get the police. That context triggered a trait, and it was probably appropriate to be more aggressive in that situation, if you get the gist. So the context triggers the different traits. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely makes sense to me. I just want to clarify some of the language stuff, Stewart, because depending which assessment you go through, or what you've done in your past, or what you're doing, you're going to hear traits, types, preferences, behavior. Just glossarize those things, if that's even a word.
I'll try and glossarize. Okay. So the first thing is there's traits and types. They're basically two different theories. Type theory sort of posits that you can, when certain things cluster together, it sort of forms a type. And that was the original psychological models, were pretty much all typing theory, which sort of stems from 100 or so years ago, 120 years ago, a medical model of when these things apply, you've got a certain condition. It's like a medical sort of frame on it. As time's gone by with the big five, a trait methodology, which he says it's all on a continuum, has become more sort of preferable in research. I'm pretty clearly in the trait camp, both academically, because my research says often these things are normally distributed and it's on a continuum. But I'm also there sort of from a humanistic psychology perspective, because I believe that we can tune up, tune down, and change. We don't need to stick with a type. Now, that's traits and types. I only use the term trait when I'm referring to things academically, or when I'm referring to other people's models that use the term trait. So I mentioned, trait activation theory. In Lumina terms, I simply talk about qualities, and that's just an attempt to sort of de-psychologicalize. I think I've made that word up. Just to call it a quality rather than a trait, to make it less threatening. And, what you were referring to, what's a preference? A preference is a bit more innate. I call that just your underlying persona. And again, an attempt to simplify it a bit. Behavior comes a bit more into what I would call your everyday. So our everyday includes our behavior. It does include our thoughts and feelings and emotions as well. But I call that your everyday persona. And some people would put behavior in there. Some psychologists don't see your behavior purely as part of your personality. So there's an academic debate. Is your personality deep buried inside you and your behavior is something else. I'm here to say, in practical terms, in my opinion, your personality is your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, and your behavior. And in the Lumina model, we put more of your behavior into that every day, and overextended. And then the overextended, what I call the overextended persona, in the literature, they will call it maladaptive traits. Yeah. They might even call it counterproductive, work behaviors. These are the words that are used in the literature. Sometimes it's called the dark side. If people like that terminology, I like the terminology of just saying you're just overextending. It's just a bit too much of a good thing because I'm trying to take the pathologizing out of it. And my preference is not to go anywhere near the DSM framework of saying psychotic and schizophrenic and how that shows up in your life. That's a bit too dark for my taste. So compared to other models, the overextended concept, it's simply too much of a good thing, is how we frame it.
I think this is what makes the tool really practical in its application, because it isn't scary. It isn't kind of medical. I'm not lying someone on a couch working out if they're a sociopath or a narcissist or that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about getting a bit of self-awareness, a bit of reflection to properly understand what you're in control of, what you're not in control of, and trying to be a bit more conscious about these things so that you can grow, adapt, develop, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it bang on. And I would say that the self-awareness piece there is central, although there is a catch with it. So we can raise our self-awareness through looking at who we are, our underlying everyday overextended. If we can understand that will raise our self-awareness. But guess what? If we just have an interesting experience, and if you were to coach me, Andy, and raise my self-awareness, but then I go back to work and carry on doing the same things I've always done, I call that the booby prize. It's the worst of all worlds. You've raised your self-awareness and then you've not used it. So ultimately, we do need to change our behavior if we're going to make use of that self-awareness. And that's why I think behavior is part of personality, because it's our expression of who we are. And it brings in that Viktor Frankl concept of your will and your choice and your freedom, which, we have the freedom to choose our behavior. We're not automatons.
I think that the word choice is such a great word in this, and especially when you're having sort of conversations along this line, actually asking someone to recognize it's a choice they're making to dial up, dial down, suppress, accentuate. It often brings about some of the biggest pauses in some of those conversations where people are like, well, am I in control of this or not? It's a really, really interesting moment in those conversations.
And it's a challenging moment, isn't it? Because it's much easier to think, well, I've just got stressed out by this event, or someone's done it to me and I can't help it. Yeah. When in fact, what we're encouraging here is a profound taking of personal responsibility for what happens when we get triggered. And I'm not pretending that's an easy thing to grapple with, but that's what we're about. And if we want to be really effective, inclusive leaders, we need to be able to look at that and do it.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by when you talk about self-awareness potentially being a booby prize if you do nothing with it. I mean, the rule of thumb would say self-awareness is incredibly important to our development. It's a starting block, right? Yes. But in your view, where does it lead to? What are the sort of other steps in the process?
Well, of course, you need to start with self-awareness. So we don't know whether it will end up the booby prize or not, because we have to start by raising it. But in my way of looking at the world, it's a great place to start. So I raise my self-awareness to who I am underneath, how I behave, how I get triggered. I raise my awareness to my values. I need to put a focus on them to discover what they really are. I maybe raise my self-awareness around my identity and what I aspire to and so on. All these things help raise my awareness, including awareness of my emotions. I'm willing to admit, if you'd met me at 18, 19, 20 years old, I didn't really acknowledge emotions in my life. I was very much in the world of logic and science. And it's taken a while for me to realize that part of self-awareness is noticing different feelings and emotions and being able to figure out where they've come from, but it's not enough. So I would say the next step is, yes, I'm aware of myself, but actually I now need to be aware of other people, and I need to be aware of their feelings, emotions, and where at. So I would wrap that up around, can I value the diversity of other people? It's easier for me to understand people who are similar to me in terms of values and personality. It's more challenging to value diversity of someone who's my complete psychological opposite, but that's the challenge. So the first thing to do with your self-awareness is then start to read other people and value the diversity around you and not judge it. It's natural to judge people that are different, negatively. We want to drop that, value it. The thing that comes after that, of course, if I can drop my judgments on others that are different, I've got a chance of building rapport with them. I've got a chance of connecting with them. And I should focus my effort on building that rapport. And if we can do that collectively, if a number of us are doing it together, then as a team, we're in with the possibility of co-creating together. We're in with the possibility of the team being inclusive, listening to each other, valuing each other, giving each other feedback. All this stems from self-awareness. Then we can have a team that co-creates, as opposed to a team that's not so self-aware, is a little bit judgmental. People are recruited in their own image. It's a bit cloney. And then when we go for results, it's not the co-creation of results. It's just driving for results, grinding for results. I'm not saying that's not effective. I do think it's more stressful. And I do think ultimately it won't tap into people's underlying purposes and probably won't result in an engaged, workforce or place to work. I'm not saying it doesn't work because many organizations do it, but I am suggesting being more aware, valuing others, building rapport, being aware of our emotions, and co-creating together is a much better way of doing it.
I think that's the sustainable route, Stewart, in the work that I do with engagement and retention, particularly.
Yes.
I think this thing around team cohesiveness and trust is what ends up being the foundation for sustainable performance, as opposed to the sort of yin and yang.
You're right. Everything I've just said, you could reframe it as it's creating more team cohesion and you're building trust. If I start to understand who you really are and you understand who I am, we're going to build trust through that process. And if you notice I'm not judging you, and vice versa, that also builds trust. What kills trust is if I think you're judging me. I'll then close down.
Absolutely. And that can be based on a whole bunch of assumptions. And I think what we end up doing with these sorts of tools is lowering the waterline on the iceberg and seeing a lot more of what really lies beneath the water. And therefore, once you see it, you can appreciate it and you can do something with it.
That's a great way of seeing self-awareness. It's lowering the waterline so we can have a look what's down there.
Absolutely.
Maybe we'll never get all the way down to the bottom. I do think there is an ultimate unconscious that we're not completely aware of, but we can take it away.
Absolutely. I'm really interested also, and it's come up a number of times recently, and I want to think about maybe some of the diversity stuff that you mentioned a bit more, but particularly with neurodiversity, right? And neuro awareness. We are, I think, a lot more conscious of these things, or beginning to get a lot more conscious about these things, and particularly at work. And has this changed, challenged, validated the work that you've done? And I asked the question because the other day, in fact, with a group, ahead of a group, I had a couple of people contact me privately to say, I need to let you know I've got ADHD, and is this going to affect my result? Is it going to affect my profile? Please help.
Yes.
So what are you seeing going on, Stuart?
Well, firstly, I think there is certainly in the UK, Europe, the US, Canada, I think there is a trend. If I go back to my childhood, people who were neurodiverse, ADHD, autism, and so on, it was an extremely negative label, back to the typing conversation, that was put on people, which could create a negative feedback loop. If you were perceived in that way, it would impact the quality of the teaching that you would experience and so on. What's changed now, I think, not completely, because there are still judgments, but people are more now open to the fact that it's not a disorder, dysfunction, or something to be ashamed of. Actually, it's just a different way of being. We are just neurodiverse rather than framing it negatively. Now, having said that, some people do still frame it negatively, of course, and it is, ADHD is technically a disorder. So I think we're on a journey where in the workplace, we are in the process of starting to see the benefits of people who are neurodiverse. In terms of Lumina Spark, because the model is designed to be inclusive, and because the model is designed not to have what I call an evaluative bias, meaning that the model is designed not to overvalue extroversion over introversion and to make sure they're both measured constructively. So, introversion can be, I listen before I give my view rather than saying you're a bit shy. Yeah. Because we've tried to remove those biases and create a holistic model, it does mean that people who are neurodiverse will find a home in the Lumina Spark model that may be less judgmental than other models. So, for example, we do know, because we've done research with neurodiverse people and people that are neurotypical, and we've got them to fill in Lumina Spark and Lumina Emotion, and we've analyzed and correlated the data. So we do know that typically, on average, people like the colleague you mentioned with ADHD are likely to be higher on inspiration driven and lower on discipline driven. So they are that, unless they go into the hyper focus mode of ADHD, and then they could become very discipline driven. So if they get their Lumina Spark portrait back and they can see that their go with the flow, their spontaneity is very constructively described and they've not been pathologized, that can be extremely encouraging for them. So I have a colleague who I work with who is autistic and is happy for me to share their story, which is that for 20 years in their career, they were perceived as too shy, too introverted, too anxious, and so on. And they were for 20 years striving at work to dial it up and fit in more, and they were masking things and so on. And interestingly, one of the things that helped them when we worked together and look at Lumina Spark was realizing there are great strengths in their introversion, and suddenly they dropped the need to be dialing up and trying to pretend they were more extroverted than they were. And suddenly they found a way of playing to their strengths and being more authentic to who they are. And they report and tell me that for them was really transformational. And I think that example is what we should be doing to help people who are neurodiverse, not have it put on them as a dysfunctional label, but to see that there are strengths in it. That's, it's humanistic psychology, it's positive psychology, call it what you want. It's a way of honoring people and respecting who they are.
And that comes back round full circle to the mission that we started with the introduction about celebrating people one human at a time, which I totally subscribe to and absolutely love.
So glad you like it. Yeah, because for me, it always starts with the individual. Often our interventions are to transform or change organizations, but actually the ingredient we work with are human beings one at a time, and we're all different and we're all precious. Yeah,
absolutely. We're a bag full of emotions, ready to be rifled through. I think we've come to the part in the show, Stewart, where it's an opportunity for us to summarize this all too short conversation, if I'm honest. But if you were to fit on 3 little sticky notes, 3 sagely pieces of practical advice, Stewart, that would help people, I don't know, maybe even think about psychometrics differently or apply them differently, what would your
now you're
pearls of wisdom be?
You're disciplined when I like my freedom. Why 3 sticky notes? I want 20. Okay, let me try. So I think we started out the conversation saying you're not a type, you're not a static thing. Your personality is a dynamic. So I think my first sticky note would be to say, as human beings, we're dynamic and we have conscious will in that process. That's who we are underneath, every day we're extended. So I guess sticky note 1, you're a dynamic, you're not a static, and you're definitely not a type. That'll be my first one. What would be my second one? Maybe we've talked about self-awareness, and I would say my next sticky note would be self-awareness is essential for our development, but it's the booby prize if you don't take action. That probably would be my second sticky note. My third one, maybe tapping into what we discussed on neurodiversity, I would say It's not a disorder. People are either neurotypical or neurodiverse. It's simply a form of diversity. So neurodiversity is about harnessing the positive and the good in everybody.
Absolutely. That broader perspective can only get better results in the end, I think, whatever we're talking about. I love those sticky notes. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. Me too. For me, I would have loved it to have been another 3 or 4 hours long. But I don't have time for that today. Stewart, thank you so much for coming on. I know you're an incredibly busy man. You're about to jet off to South Africa and all the good things over there. So thank you so much for being here.
Andy, thank you for taking the time to ask me such stimulating questions and the privilege of sharing it with all your listeners. So thank you.
No, brilliant. Well, look, you take care, my friend, and I hope to see you again soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Okay, everyone. That was Dr. Stewart Desson. And if you'd like to find out a bit more about him or any of the topics that we've covered today, please check out the show notes. So, that concludes today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, found it interesting, and heard something maybe that will help you become a stickier, more successful business from the inside going forward. If you have, please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps. I'm Andy Gorham, and you've been listening to the Sticky from the Inside podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.